Morning, everyone, and welcome to another Madrasa-Midrasha program. My name is Mahjubeen Dhala, and I'm the director of this program, which is committed to enhancing and developing dialogue between the Jewish and Islamic traditions within the academy and beyond. For today, we have an interesting topic, and it is called Jews and Muslims in America. We live in a country which by far is the most religiously diverse nation in the world, often referred to as the melting pot of different religions, ethnicities, and cultures. Jewish and Muslim communities in America are roughly equal in numbers, boast an over than average levels of education, literacy, and income, and both struggle with similar concerns in matters of cultural assimilation, political representation, and media attention. And both share a common history of bigotry and marginalization as immigrant communities in the US. I ask you now to join me in extending a warm welcome to our two presenters for today. We have Dr. Shari Rabin, a scholar of modern Judaism and American religions. She's the author of the award-winning book, Jews on the Frontier, Religion and Mobility in 19th Century America. She's currently writing a history of Jews, religion, and race in the US South from the 17th century to the present day. Dr. Amir Hussain is chair and professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where he teaches courses on religion. His own particular specialty is in the study of Islam, focusing on contemporary Muslim societies in North America. And he has written widely on the topic of Muslims in America. Welcome to you both. I invite you both to enlighten us on this topic for today of the experiences, the origins, and the contributions that Jews and Muslims have made to the American society. Welcome, Dr. Shari Rabin.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. And I want to share a little bit of text with you all from a document that has transfixed me for the last couple of years. And I'm going to put some text in the chat and also a link. So it's the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, which were co-authored by John Locke in 1669 when he was the secretary for the colonial proprietors. And they created this sort of utopian plan for a new colony. And it was written in London before a settlement had even begun. And I've sort of condensed the sort of key parts here. They wrote, "It will not be reasonable for us to keep out Jews, heathens, and other dissenters from the purity of Christian religion. Any 7 or more persons agreeing in any religion shall constitute a church or profession to which they shall give some name to distinguish it from others." So there's 2 parts that I think are interesting here for me. The first is Jews, heathens, and other dissenters. That line has really fascinated me. Why include Jews here? There's a number of reasons. There were Jews in other English and Dutch colonies, and they had a reputation for being skillful merchants. Carolina abutted Spanish Florida, and Jews, along with Muslims, had been expelled from Spain. So maybe that informed the decision. But it's a little bit unusual because Jews had only been readmitted to England and only informally in 1655. So actually when English colonization of the Americas began, Jews had been expelled for centuries from English territories. So the relevant section that I gave you a snippet of, it begins by laying out a typology of 2 different kinds of people that they're envisioning coming to Carolina. The first are the natives of that place who are strangers to Christianity. And those folks are going to receive a kind of passive toleration. They write that their ignorance or mistake gives us no right to expel or use them ill. On the other hand, there are those who remove from other parts to plant there, who will unavoidably be of different opinions concerning matters of religion. So these people just, different opinions, they will kind of positively expect to have liberty. So it lays out these 2 different kinds of person, and then Jews are kind of thrown in there too. And it's left a little bit unclear sort of where Jews fit? Why include them? There is at this time in the 17th century a relatively new scheme of dividing the world into 4 parts: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and idolatry. Muslims were seen at the time as an external competitor for global power in many senses, which Jews were not, but both are placed in the middle of this new kind of spectrum of what is understood to be false religions. And so in this kind of moment of colonial endeavor in Carolina, Jews are sort of in the mix in this discussion of heathens and dissenters. The second part that interests me is the church or profession, which is of course a very Protestant understanding of religion as belief and worship. And elsewhere in the same document, it talks about speculative opinions in religion or way of worship that people shouldn't be persecuted for. So there is this sort of sense that religion is belief and worship, which would have been odd for indigenous communities, but also for Jews, right, whose collective identity was rooted in a shared ancestry and in a system of religious law that touched on every part of life. You know, a speculative opinion does not easily apply to Judaism. It's important to note too that this same document also states that every free man of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves of what opinion or religion soever. So whereas it had once been understood that Christians could not be enslaved, this document's part of a broader move in this period to link slavery firmly and unequivocally to race and to make religion irrelevant to political status. So there's a lot going on in this document that I think is really rich and interesting. And you know, usually narratives of Jews in American history, they begin in New Amsterdam in 1654. There's a famous letter from Peter Stuyvesant, who was very unhappy that a group of Jews had fled the Portuguese in Brazil to come to New Amsterdam. And that's kind of the sort of starting point. But I think actually this document, the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, it's really useful because it shows Jews being imagined at the outset of a colony that began as an English colony and a colony where slavery is front and center from the beginning. And so I think it highlights some of the key dynamics of American Jewish history in a really helpful way. So what ends up happening in Carolina? So Jews do start to come gradually, and they start to gain access to the materials of colonial power in the 1690s. We have these little hints of what Jews are up to. There's a Jewish interpreter with the Yamasee Indians in the 1690s. It's a Spanish language interpreter. There's a transaction documented between 2 Jewish men involving an enslaved man named Dick. And a number of Jews are granted naturalization. And interestingly, it's as part of an act granting liberty of conscience to all Protestants. So Jews are fully part of indigenous removal, slavery, and they're granted citizenship, but there's still this persistent linkage between whiteness and Christianity, and Englishness too, right? This sense that if Jews are going to be included as free men, they have to be still classified as Protestants. 50 years after this, Jews do create a congregation. And interestingly, they give it the name Beth Elohim, or House of God, which is a marked departure from other Atlantic Jewish communities, which largely chose messianic names. Remnant of Israel, Hope of Israel, Rock of Israel. So this name, House of God, really expresses, I think, a sense of rootedness and also a kind of theological and conceptual shift in how they're thinking about themselves. They also erect an elaborate gravestone for their religious functionary that basically gives him the same honorifics of the Bishop of London. And in their wills, many of which include the bequeathing of enslaved people, we also see these sort of assertive expressions of monotheistic belief, including the Hero Israel Shema prayer, for example. So what we see here in early Carolina are first Jews coming to be seen as proximate to or even as Protestant dissenters, right? That's how they can be made sense of and included. And we also see Jews kind of shaping their community into a kind of church or profession. Right, so they're responding to some of the sort of patterns of social organization and thought that we saw in the fundamental constitutions. And in some ways, the US founding documents sort of continue this in certain ways. Certainly, it continues to favor whiteness in terms of citizenship. And the First Amendment, it groups religion with speech, press, petition, and assembly, right? So continuing that idea of religion as being about sort of what you believe in and who you gather with. But interestingly, these founding documents do not mention Jews at all. They're never mentioned. And if we think of them as part of the English legal tradition, then it's interesting that Jews go from being explicitly expelled and excluded to just totally unremarkable and not even worth mentioning in 125 years. Jews in the early US are simply assumed to be free white people with access to naturalization and a denomination with access to religious freedom, categorizations that sort of go together. Indeed, religious freedom was regularly denied to natives and enslaved people whose practices were not even seen as religion. They were deemed, superstition, for instance. So there's this coming into this sense of belonging and understanding of religion. But of course, history is not unidirectional, and this conversion was not total. It was periodically challenged by the sort of resurgence of older anti-Jewish polemics, by those who wanted to reassert Christianity as the basis of belonging, and also by public forms of Jewish difference that overflowed the constraints of belief and worship alone. And so this is how we get many of the sort of paradoxes and complexities of American Jewish history, of which there are many. In terms of American understandings of Jews, we see Jews cast as kind of white neo-dissenters and as racially ambiguous kind of neo-heathens. For instance, we have Judah P. Benjamin, who is included as one of the architects of the Confederacy. And we have Leo Frank, a Jewish pencil factory owner in Atlanta, who was lynched in 1915. We have a spate of synagogue bombings in 1957 and 1958, which were targeting Jews for their perceived influence in the civil rights movement. And in 1959, we have Solomon Blatt, a high-ranking politician in South Carolina, claim that his election is proof that South Carolina is perfectly tolerant, and in fact saying that nowhere else on the face of the earth are Negroes happier than in South Carolina. We have Orthodox Jew Jared Kushner in the White House, and chants of Jews will not replace us in Charlottesville. And in terms of Jews' own adaptations to American life, we see efforts by Jews to cast themselves as a kind of church of believers, and clear signs of the limitations of that framing. So for instance, in Charleston in the early 19th century, there's an attempt to create an enlightened Judaism that becomes the first Jewish religious reform movement in the US. And we see a Saturday Sabbath observer fighting in court to claim that his religious freedom was being violated by Sunday closing laws. We have Beth Elohim forbidding Black converts from being members in its constitution, but allowing an enslaved Jewish man named Billy Simons to sit in the pews with other congregants. We have the widespread presence of marriage and conversion between Jews and Christians, and tremendous anxiety about those. We have the synagogue as the sort of understood as the center of American Jewish life, and actually very few American Jews actually joining or attending them. So there's our specific histories that are important to each of the examples I've just given, but I think it is helpful to look back at the earliest years of English colonization in order to understand how ambivalence about Jews is a persistent feature of American society, linked to understandings of human difference that are both racial and religious, and that are always determined in relationship to other outside groups. Jews are always being considered in conversation with other kinds of groups. And it also helps us understand how Jews are influenced not only by a desire to sort of copy their Protestant neighbors, but by the Protestant framing of religion itself, the understanding in the US that religion is this matter of belief and worship. So are Jews heathens or dissenters? Can they be made into a church or a profession? In different forms, these are sort of the questions that are central to American Jewish history. And I first heard of the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina in Charleston from a tour guide at Beth Elohim, which is still it's a Reformed Jewish congregation, very proud of its history. And they mentioned Jews, heathens, and other dissenters to sort of get a laugh line. but also as an example of South Carolina's benevolent religious freedom. They very gingerly sidestep or less charitably ignore the context of racial slavery and indigenous removal, as well as the alternate histories of Jewish marginalization in the state. But I think in its full complexity and context, this document and the questions and the histories that it brings to the surface speaks to some of the knotty political questions that are at the heart of sort of contemporary discussions about anti-Semitism, white privilege, and movements for social justice. And I'll end by just saying that I think bringing Jews and Judaism more fully into our understandings of American history doesn't just offer diversity for its own sake. I think first, Jews offer an argument for looking beyond institutions and beliefs to understand religious life. You can't tell Jewish history apart from the legal, economic, political, and social history of Jewish people. And I'm not sure you can or should tell other religious histories that way either. And I think also Jews offer an additional vantage point on the complicated politics of belonging in America, in large part because they have operated as both objects and subjects of those politics from the very beginning of colonization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shari. Thank you for sharing that with us and helping us place the Jews in American histories, and of course, understanding how Judaism has transformed in American history since the Constitution of Carolina. Before I invite Dr. Hussain to present his talk, I just want to remind everyone that you are welcome to share any reflections or any questions that you might have in the Q&A feature of the webinar, and we'll make sure that our presenters are addressed. Those questions are addressed to our presenters, and if time does not permit us to do that, then we will make sure that you get their emails so that you can continue conversations with them. So join me now in welcoming Dr. Amir Hussain, and the title of his talk is Anti-Racism and Teaching About American Muslims. He will look at the history of American Muslims, especially African slaves and African-American Muslims, and connect that to civil rights, Malcolm X, and contemporary situations, of course, like the murder trial, the trial of the murder of George Floyd. Welcome, Dr. Hussain.
Good morning to those of you in California, and good afternoon to those of you in Ohio and on the East Coast. It's a real privilege to be here, and thanks to Dr. Rabin for that wonderful presentation. I was taking notes as you were doing that, and thanks to Dr. Dalla for her thoughts at the beginning, connecting this. I want to do that towards the end of my talk, make some connections between the present connections between Muslims and Jews, which I think now are needed more than ever. And just a shout out to someone you can't see, Matthew Hartman, who's the wizard behind the screens doing all this. So thank you, Matt, for your work. I have a PowerPoint that I want to share, but I want to focus on me just for a second, not for me, but because of the shirt. I chose this for a deliberate reason. It's a Chilkat design from northern British Columbia, and you're always conscious of the lands that you're on, and we're here on the land of the Tongva, of the Gabrielino here, and that becomes more and more important these days. I grew up in Canada. I'm going to share this PowerPoint here with you, so hopefully you all can see the PowerPoint. I grew up in Canada, and I've been here now for 25 years teaching about Islam and Muslims. Real privilege to be at Loyola Marymount University here in Los Angeles. But if you've been following the news, you know what happened last month in Canada, the discovery of 215 children's graves. It's always difficult to say 215 children's graves without getting emotional here. The fact that they're unmarked just adds to that. So this was from the Kamloops Residential School in British Columbia. This is a memorial at the Vancouver Art Gallery that took place a few weeks ago there. And then the picture on the bottom right, it's the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, laying flowers at the memorial for the Afsal family last week. 4 family members, a grandmother, mother, father, daughter, a 9-year-old boy survives, racist, Islamophobic attack where someone deliberately, drives a pickup truck and kills, 4 people there. And so you begin with that because we're talking about history, but it's real. Dr. Rabin alluded to Charlottesville and those horrific Jews will not replace us chants. This is very real here, even though we're talking about historical things. Many of you may have seen the Regina King film, One Night in Miami, this wonderful film that talks about this particular night, February 25th, 64, when Muhammad Ali wins the heavyweight championship and invites his friends, Malcolm X, Jim Brown, and Sam Cooke to celebrate. And I start with that because I think we don't think about Malcolm X often enough when we talk about civil rights. I don't think we think about civil rights often enough. I don't think we talk about Malcolm often enough. And I've been teaching a class on Islam in America, and one of the things we were talking about was this statement that Malcolm made in March of '64, talking about the hate in America after the murder of President Kennedy in November of 1963. And that famous line of progress is healing the wound. Haven't even pulled the knife out, much less heal the wound. They won't even admit the knife is there. And I think that's part of the issue. We're still having these kinds of difficult conversations about race in America, and Jews and Muslims, I think, are involved in that in really kinds of interesting ways here. I think of, one of our great scholars, James Cone, who passed away a couple of years ago, and one of his many books, Martin and Malcolm and America, A Dream or a Nightmare. I don't think we talk enough about Dr. King. I don't think we talk enough about Malcolm X. It was fascinating in the last year with the protests of the murder of George Floyd to see images of Malcolm, to see images of Dr. King, and talk a little bit about that history. And from that book, Dr. Cone had this great line of the connections here. Christianity represented by Dr. King, Islam represented by Malcolm X. And, I love that line here, in his preface: I needed both Martin and Malcolm to defend Black humanity under assault by white supremacy in America. And I understood why they talked differently about Christianity and Blackness, nonviolence and violence, love and hate. I think that's crucial. Do we pay attention to these things? Do we look at how Dr. King was viewed? In '67, he was not viewed as this, wonderful example of America. Most Americans in '66, '67 didn't like Dr. King. He was against the war. He was for civil rights. These were not popular things here. You link that to the support of unionized workers, and that's downright un-American in the '60s. Now that he's been safely dead for 60 years, we can talk about him, or 50 years, we can talk about him in a very different sort of way there. I think it's a similar thing with Malcolm, But let me say a few things about the history here of Islam in our country. And I start with a talk that President Obama gave. One of his first speeches as president outside the US was in Cairo in June of 2009. And he talked about the history of Islam in America. And that's where the book that I started with, Muslims the Making of America, came out of. I thought most Americans don't know this, the history of Islam in America, the connections here, and I started thinking about, my great heroes as a Muslim kid growing up in Toronto. First of them was, greatest basketball player ever. It's not Mr. James. For those of you in Chicago, Dr. Rabin, I apologize if I'm offending you here. It's not Mr. Jordan. It's Kareem here. We don't think about him all that often. All-time leading scorer in the NBA, 19-time All-Star, 6-time champion, very much a Muslim, here, but also very much involved. I'm not talking about his basketball prowess, but about his work. This image, and I think about this, he hadn't even come to UCLA this way. This is June 4th, 1967, famous Gordon Parks photograph of the Cleveland Summit. Muhammad Ali sitting there, second from Bill Russell. Muhammad Ali had in April refused induction into the Army for the Vietnam War. And this was the sort of Cleveland Summit in June of 1967, June 4th. And you see Bill Russell there seated, Muhammad Ali, Jim Brown, and a young Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who's just about to come to UCLA to play basketball. So Kareem's been involved in this, 50 years. 50 years later, he's still at it. This Friday is Juneteenth. I'm delighted that our president, LMU, Tim Snyder, has declared Juneteenth the holiday. So we have a holiday on Friday, as we all should. Saturday, the History Channel is doing this documentary, Fight the Power, that Kareem is co-producing. That's part of the work that he's been doing for over 50 years, looking at social justice, looking at those civil rights struggles. And I just had to share this, our last commencement in person was 2019, and Kareem was our commencement speaker. So it was great to be able to meet him, to give him a stole from our Office of Muslim Student Life. And it's just, amazing chance to meet, one of your heroes. But this is someone who's been doing this kind of work. And do we pay attention to that? Another one of my great heroes, started with the picture at the beginning, Muhammad Ali. When Ali died in 2016, perhaps the most beloved American, also an American Muslim, who in 67 was not beloved. I was thinking, Dr. Rabin, as you were talking about, Ali's funeral service and the many, many guests that were there, including Billy Crystal. And Billy Crystal talked about his decades-long friendship with Muhammad Ali, and how when the Hebrew University of Jerusalem had come up with a scholarship in Billy Crystal's name, Ali was one of the people to help him fundraise. There he was, the most famous Muslim man in the world, helping his Jewish friend, fundraising for a scholarship at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Those are the kinds of connections, I'm talking about between Muslims, particularly African-American Muslims and Jews here. The history goes back to the slave trade. I was a kid when I watched Roots on TV and learned that Kunta Kinte, the ancestor of Alex Haley, who was brought to Annapolis, was a Muslim. I thought, Muslims? There were Muslims who were slaves? Who knew this, Well, of course, 10% of the slaves brought over from West Africa were Muslim. Many of you may not know this place, Duane Street, Lower Manhattan, the black and white pictures, 1991, when they're doing some renovations, they always do in Lower Manhattan, and find bones. You got to stop and you realize, oh, these are very old bones. This is a mass grave. It's the African Burial Ground National Monument that was proclaimed by President George W. Bush in 2006, opened in 2007. This idea that in Lower Manhattan, you've got no surprise, because the slave ships that docked in Lower Manhattan, graves, mass graves of African slaves, including some African Muslim slaves that were there. Sylvain Diouf, who was the Schomburg Center, now is at Brown University at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, is the woman that's written the most on this. So if you want to read more about, the history of African slaves, Sylvain's work is just extraordinary. A couple of the books there, the most famous being the one on the top left, Servants of Allah. The picture is Job bin Solomon, one of the many Muslims who had a biography written about him. You've got Job bin Solomon, you've got Oberlin College, you have Muhammad Bakakwa, lots of African Muslim slaves in colonial and early America, here, and we have stories about them, including stories of Muslim women slaves. We don't have any extant biographies of African Muslim women slaves. Julie Dash in 1991 did this great film, Daughters of the Dust. It was at the time the first wide release film by an African-American woman director. Didn't get a lot of press in 91, got a major re-release in 2016. This is the 25th anniversary poster of it. And by the way, this is Julie Dash, the director there. Got a major re-release because one of the young girls who saw it in 1991 had been taken to it by her mother, who wanted to show her what, African-American women could do. That young woman is Beyonce Knowles. Beyonce's mom took her to see that film in 1991. Beyonce remembered that film. If you watch Lemonade, the film, you'll see some shot-for-shot recreations of Daughters of the Dust. That stays with you, and so you have these really, really interesting kinds of things here, but it's not just African-American history that's part of Muslim history. You look, for example, here in Los Angeles, one of our greatest artists, Iranian Los Angelino, Shirin Nishat, and I use her just an example of the diversity here of American Muslims. A quarter of American Muslims are African-American. A third are people who are Middle Eastern, and Middle Eastern in this town could be Iranian, like Shirin. It could be Arab. It could be Turkish. A third of us are Middle East. A third of us are South Asian, people like me. from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. You look at Fazlur Rahman Khan, the person that was responsible really for the building of the Sears Tower in Chicago, the John Hancock building, this Bangladeshi structural engineer who made possible the construction of these very tall buildings. So what's Islam in America look like? It's a South Asian face. It's a Middle Eastern face. It's an African-American face. But there's that history, and I want to come to the conclusion, just a couple of things here. We all know Colin Kaepernick in the 2016 kneeling, and it's fascinating because they're actually holding the same picture of the Cleveland Summit that I showed you earlier. The guy beside him is Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, who in 1996, while playing for the Denver Nuggets, refused to stand for one game for the national anthem because of his Muslim conscience. That created a firestorm there. But this is all by way of saying, when we talk about American Muslim history, do we talk about the civil rights legacy, that's there? I talked about Muhammad Ali's funeral, and one of the people that spoke was Ambassador Attila Shabazz, the oldest daughter of Malcolm X, and she said this, at her father's, at Muhammad Ali's funeral, but of course was talking about her father. This was June 10th, 2016, my dad would often state, and her dad's Malcolm X, my dad would often state when concluding or parting from one another, may we meet again in the light of understanding. And I say to you, with the light of that compass, by any means necessary. Talking about the ancestors, the people that have gone on here. And I think it's important to pause, to remember them, but also to think about the president. I'll conclude with two things here. One is that direct connection here. I flew back. I was going to, it's one of the, you can't make this up. We can talk about this in the Q&A period. I flew to Washington, D.C. on Friday, January 27th, 2017. I landed and the first iteration of the travel ban had happened. I flew back to Los Angeles on the Sunday. These were the signs that you saw. The first people to organize the protests against the Muslim bans were Jews. This is another example of this. Jews standing up for Muslims, standing up with Muslims. Again, we can talk more about this, I think, in the Q&A. But we often don't think about some of that history. I love this picture because it's impossibly young Keith Ellison in 2007 being sworn in as the first Muslim to Congress in Minnesota. Nancy Pelosi, who remarkably still looks exactly the same, swearing him in. This is the private ceremony. He's sworn in on Thomas Jefferson's Quran, because that was the controversy. First Muslim in America, are you sworn in on the Quran? Well, you can't be sworn in the Quran, you have to be sworn in the Bible. Wait, you don't have to be sworn in the Bible because that's a religious test. We don't have that. In private, you can do what you want. Keith Ellison says, what if it's Thomas Jefferson's Quran? And that's actually Thomas Jefferson's Quran that Jefferson publishes in 1765, purchases, not publishes, it's the sale translation. Jefferson gets the Quran in 1765. Keith Ellison is sworn in on Thomas Jefferson's Quran. Keith Ellison's also the Attorney General in Minnesota who prosecutes the murderer of George Floyd. Does he do it because he's a Muslim? No, he does it because he's a darn good lawyer and prosecutor. But he's also a Muslim who understands, what this is, the microaggressions, the macroaggressions that those of us who live in this brown skin or wear a hijab or wear, a kufi or a yarmulke or a kippah or may have a long beard or have a black coat or walk with their families, have to deal with. And I think there's some really interesting stuff here going on, about the connections historically with Muslims and civil rights and the contemporary period. I want to thank you all for this. It's been a great pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much to both our distinguished presenters. Thank you so much for giving us this unique lens with which we can assess the landscape in America in the contemporary climate, and of course, where our origins and roots have led us to this. So thank you so much for both your presentations. We have a few questions here, a couple of questions here, but before I address those questions to you, I want to invite you to share reflections on each other's talks, if there are any, and then we'll proceed from there. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That was such an interesting talk. And I wrote down also a lot of notes and have a lot of reflections. And just on the question of religious tests, I mentioned that originally the First Amendment didn't apply to states. And so there were religious tests in the 19th century, and Jews were the like non-Christians to whom that might apply. So they had to sort of like fight to have the religious text. So you see to have religious tests abolished. So you see the sort of deep roots of some of these sort of elements of suspicion, and then the efforts to sort of draw on those lessons and combat them. And I'll also, if we're talking about civil rights heroes, I love putting things in the chat, and teaching, especially just Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's classic Religion and Race essay, which just begins so powerfully. The first conference on religion and race was between Pharaoh and Moses. And in addition to sort of that history, just the history of Black Muslims, just I feel like I mentioned briefly Billy Simon, who's this amazing 19th century Black Jew who's sort of showing up in Jewish spaces, even when he might not be fully welcomed. And one of the interesting things in the last 10, 15 years in Jewish communities is the sort of increased attentiveness to Black Jewish voices. And so putting also in the chat, Rabbi Sandra Lawson's Prayer for Ferguson, which is a really powerful Black Jewish reflection. Also, Billy Crystal connection. He was very present at Tiffany Haddish's bat mitzvah. I don't know if you saw the images. He had a ritual role in Tiffany Haddish's bat mitzvah. So Billy Crystal, I guess, is just everywhere. And then finally, I also just wanted to mention in the sort of name of thinking about connections, Judith Weisenfeld's recent book, New World A Coming, which talks about Black migrants in the 1920s who are looking to Islam and Judaism in these sort of new and creative ways as sort of ways of meaning making and self-understanding for Black peoples. And it's interesting to think about these Black Jews and Muslims sort of crossing in the streets of Detroit or Chicago, and both all looking for justice and looking for a greater sense of being at home in a religious tradition. So I think that's an interesting moment to think about as well.
Thanks. Amir, did you want to say something, or?
Yeah, just one quick response, and I'm going to throw it open for the questions here, is precisely, I think it's those kinds of connections. I'm just speaking personally that, as a Muslim kid who'd come, I was born in Pakistan, I came to Canada in 1970, and in Canada, or Toronto in 1970, was a British city. Forget about being a white city, like the Italian was the exotic other, the Jew was the exotic other, that kind of thing. But you really had, so the connections that I had, especially in terms of diet, were with Jewish friends, and that sense of, it was normal to, let me start that again. If you didn't eat pork, there was a word for that. You kept kosher, you were Jewish, so that was sort of acceptable in a way that certain other things perhaps weren't. And I think back to Kareem, when Kareem made his conversion, he talked about, in a very powerful way, about some of the anti-Semitism that he'd developed, and it was actually his mentor who was responsible for conversion that said, no, you got to look at it in a completely different way. Like the reason you can get, a kosher hot dog in New York, long before you get a halal hot dog. Now it's all the halal guys and all the halal stuff. But, back in the day, you couldn't do that. It's the Jewish community that does this. And so I think those kinds of connections, become really powerful. And that's one of the things that I always have to, unfortunately remind my students about when we talk about the rise in hate crimes, the Islamophobia, that sort of stuff. Well over half the hate crimes against a religion in this country are still against Jews. And you think about that, like the history that, Dr. Rabin has been talking about, the real, crucial identity formation of America with respect to its Jewish citizens. And yet you still have this level of anti-Semitism, of violence, of hatred. I'm thinking back to the memorial that we had about the Tree of Life shooting, and that's a great example. Why is that synagogue targeted? Well, because that synagogue has an office that is working precisely to help refugees, to help in the settlement of refugees. And this is seen, as a threat. So I think for me, it's those linkages, I think, between American Muslims and American Jews that are crucial. And I'll say one thing and I'll stop here. And thanks to Dr. Rabin for the shout out, to Rabbi Heschel. I was privileged years ago to be on a panel conference that his daughter, Susanna Heschel, had organized, looking at anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And if you look at, we can go on in a whole other direction on this. If you look at the 18th, 19th century, the sort of hook-nosed Arab, hook-nosed Jew, you could swap the line out. And, the way in which Muslims, especially in the Arab form, and Jews were configured by sort of racists in America was exactly the same as foreigners who don't belong in this, white, read Protestant, sort of country there. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing your reflections on each other's talk. I'm very cognizant of the time. We're trying to keep our event today for within the hour, hopefully by noon, maybe 5 minutes over that, but not more than that. I have a few questions here, a couple to Dr. Rabin and then one addressed to both of you. So I'll start with you, Dr. Rabin, and this question reads, and I'll just read it out to you here. I'm curious about the origins and the impacts of the term Judo-Christian. Is this an artifact of the insider-outsider status of Jews in America? We hear about America's Judo-Christian history. Is this a bone thrown to Jews of particular persuasions to bring them along into particular political perspectives? In short, is this term mostly benign or mostly promiscuous? How does this term operate functionally in modern America? So a lot there to chew on, but I hope you can do a quick justice on it.
Yeah, no, that's a really important and fascinating question. And there's been a lot of really good scholarship on this recently, which points out how Judeo-Christian is this product of a particular moment. It's like the Cold War moment and the Cold War post-Holocaust attempt to sort of fight godless communism by proving America's piety and diversity. So my feeling about it is that it ends up being a lot more about the Christian than the Judeo. And it's being sort of developed at a time when, Judaism is being elevated, but also Jews are being targeted sort of relentlessly as suspected communists. So it does a lot of sort of ideological work. And I think, to think about connections, there's also, a strong resemblance to the post 9/11 sort of Abrahamic conversation, right? And what does this work of sort of lumping together do? Is it helpful? Does it help to create connections, or does it sort of help perpetuate sort of certain ideas and forces of power, right? And it's a real challenge. How do you create connections among different communities? But Judeo-Christian, especially as it has morphed into the present day, it tends to be more about the Christian, and it's sort of a fig leaf, to my mind, it's sort of a fig leaf of diversity that is not usually actually speaking to Jewish interests and concerns and sensibilities.
Thank you, Dr. Rabin, for that. We have like a cluster of questions here which are addressed to you both, and I think I'll just try and sum them up together, and you're welcome to chime in any order that you please. So I think this question is really taking us to that very difficult part that I think both communities in America are sort of sensing at this moment, this particular moment, because despite the shared experiences of prejudice and persecution, I don't think that both communities can stay unaffected by global events that are happening with their co-religionists in other parts of the world. So this questioner asks us, and it's a cluster of questions, and I'll try and sum them up together, says, to both speakers, do either of you maintain relationships with Muslims, Jews in your lives today? Can you elaborate? What are places we can go to seek out friendships? And does the word anti-Semitic refer to prejudice, refer as a prejudice term against both groups? Can that term be applied to both groups? So that's the question.
Let me start with that because it gives me a chance to have the shameless plug. I think, here you go, for the book, Muslims in the Making of America. I'll put that away now. The book actually begins with the Rosh Hashanah service in 2015 that my friend, Rabbi Sharon Brous from Ikar, had invited me to come to. I've known Sharon for years here. We met at David Myers' place, and David at the time was the chair of history at UCLA. But if you remember 2015, that was the Syrian refugee crisis. That's just after the pictures of, Alan Kurdi, the little boy who'd been killed, washed ashore there, had surfaced. And there's about 1,000 people at this Rosh Hashanah service. I'm probably the only Muslim, that's there. So I know that Sharon isn't telling the story for my benefit. She's telling it for the 999, Jewish folks, who are there. But talking about why American Jews should support more, not fewer refugees, coming in, and connecting it to the story of the St. Louis in 1939, the ship that was refused to be docked in the U.S., sent back, and the people in there were murdered in the Holocaust. It's that sort of connection. And so I think there's that part. I'm just looking at the list of attendees, and I'm delighted to see friends that I've invited: Rabbi Mel Gottlieb, from the Academy of Jewish Religion; Rabbi Mark Diamond, who teaches with us; Rhonda Rosen, who's in our library, who works on the Jewish Book Group, and she's had me come speak with David at the Jewish Book Group. So you have just those kinds of things. And for me, I think, and I'll stop here, it goes back to that affinity. Like I love being in Jewish settings for no other reason than I don't have to ask what's in the food. I never have to say, like, okay, those sandwiches, is it like pork or ham? And you learn you have to make those distinctions, because of course I've been told for some folks that ham isn't pork. Let's not go into that position, but is there pork in this? Is there pork in that? Is that kind of stuff? And so just those kinds of connections, I think, are really powerful. So for me, that's one of the great joys of living in Los Angeles, is you have this extraordinary diversity of both the Muslim communities and the Jewish communities in the plural, and making those kinds of connections and making those kinds of links. We have Rabbi Zach Zeisman here in our Office of Jewish Student Life that connects with our Office of Muslim Student Life. So I think absolutely, it's I would even go to say at least on a weekly, if not a daily basis, you have those kinds of interactions with Jewish friends, and it's really that they're my friends. The professional relationship develops out of that friend relationship.
And I would just say that in addition to the personal relationship, and also maybe like as the orient and or place to start in terms of developing personal relationships, I'd say on one hand, like learning is a good sort of form of relationship. And this is maybe the place to mention what I tweeted about this conversation. This invitation to this conversation reminded me of a private reading I took with Dr. Keisha Ali in undergrad at Boston University on Islam in America. And that course was so transformative for me in seeing those connections and parallels that we've been talking about. And in my own teaching, I also bring these materials into conversation. I always have students since the Muslim ban, close read the Muslim ban as a primary source and bring it into conversation with primary sources about Jewish immigration in the early 20th century. So I think those sorts of forms of learning and being open to learning is important. And also, activism and organizing within your community and in ways that are in solidarity with other kinds of communities. And that's, I think, been something really heartening over the last few years is a really robust, progressive Jewish social justice kind of world. And I'll also just mention as one model for this kind of sort of learning and activism, when I lived in Charleston, South Carolina, I see my colleague from there, Dale Rosengarten, is here. There is an annual Jewish Muslim meal to the point about pork as well, called Food and Faith. And it's like a different topic every year, and an imam and a rabbi speak. And it's a very grassroots way for community members to learn, to sort of think about broader issues, and also to sort of develop those kinds of personal relationships, which I agree are so important in a world that wants to sort of highlight the differences and to divide and, emphasize distinctive, interests. And I think, for Jewish people, and the sort of, I guess, elephant in the room around this is Israel-Palestine. And I think, what you see here is, and what American Jews need to do is think about, what really are the lessons of our history, of Jewish history writ large, of Jewish history in America. And my hope is that those histories lead people to positions of solidarity.
Yeah, thank you both for your reflections, and thank you, Dr. Rabin, for naming the elephant in the room, because this has been quite a contemporary conversation that has been going on in our communities here at the GTU, and of course the larger communities across universities, in the nation. And I think this specific trial or this specific challenge is going to reshape what collaboration looks like, at least for the communities who are here in the United States. I have this question here that is directed at you, Dr. Rabin, and I'll just read it out for you. While you note that Jews in South Carolina experience were viewed among dissenting Protestants, is there any indication of how Jews of the time may have responded to being contextualized in this way?
So just as a historical note, the documents from that period are very sparse. So it is not easy to get a sense of it. But my sense is that there is a sort of pragmatism. Like, if you're gonna give me rights, sure, call me a Protestant, right? So there is that kind of pragmatism, right? And I think that's what you see in for much of American Jewish history, is Jews kind of being okay with being slotted into sort of white religion as the sort of classification, until they're not, until there are moments where that's being questioned by outsiders, or where Jews' own interests, like I mentioned the case of Sunday closing laws, for instance, right, where because abstaining from work on a particular day is not seen as worship or belief in a narrow way, they're being forced to violate their own Sabbath, right? That those are the moments that sort of impel them to fight back, and they do show a lot of savvy and confidence in saying, you have these religious freedom laws on the books, and we're going to go after them, even if you're not including us in them, or if you don't see us as part of that. And this is part of a whole broader conversation we could have just about religious freedom. And there's a lot of exciting work happening on the sort of politics and history of religious freedom, and how limiting it can be, but also how empowering it can be for different groups.
Thank you so much for taking the time to enlighten us on this very diverse topic. I know this is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much that needs to come into conversation. But I really want to thank you for your time and for your direction, and for sharing those resources, Dr. Rabin, in the chat. And also, I made a list of movies that I need to watch now, Dr. Hussain. I know I watched it at some point, but I need to revisit them again. And of course, to look at all these things that we've borne for granted, and the connections that lie embedded and deep within there. So thank you so much for enlightening us with this talk. I also want to say a big thank you to Dr. Hussain for reminding us of the land that we are on, and for acknowledging that. I think that is such an important practice that we must sort of iterate here. And of course, it brings tears to the eyes to see that even in this day and age, where we talk about pluralism, where we talk about diversity, and we talk about embracing cultures and ethnicities, you still find that you're not really secure to take your family out for a walk, and for mentioning that and for naming that. So thank you so much. I think this has been at least for me, a very important time of looking deep into our roots, and also moving forward with hope in a world that can give this security to everyone, not just to the communities that are here in the United States, but also through a new form of collaboration to sort of give a model of how people can work together to bring peace in different conflict-stricken parts of the world. So thank you so much for your time. I must also, acknowledge the Walter and Elise Haas grant that allows us to bring these programming to our community. And of course, thank you to Matt Hartman, who is always the angel in the background, helping us bring this programming smoothly to all our attendees. Once again, I thank you all for your presence, for your knowledge, for your wisdom. I thank you for being here this morning and for facilitating this conversation and taking it into our communities. So if there aren't any final remarks, then I think we are pretty good for time, and we are actually completing within time. Thank you so much, and have a great day.